Hello and welcome to Two Peds in a Pod, the paediatric medical education podcast. Remember, you can hear our entire back catalogue of episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and of course, our SoundCloud. So please tell your colleagues and friends and hit that subscribe button. I hope you enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to another Two Peds in a Pod podcast. My name's Ashley Reece. I'm a paediatrician. I work at West Hertfordshire Hospitals. It's great to be in the chair for this episode, dealing with the issue of civility, rudeness and unprofessional behaviour. And if you didn't think that that was a problem in the NHS in the UK, the staff survey found 1 in 5 healthcare workers reported being bullied or undermined by a colleague in 2018. And according to the BMA, it's 3 times higher than the wider workforce, with 98% of people reporting experiencing uncivil behaviour in a study by the Harvard Business Review. So this is something that really is out there and important. And what about civility and kindness in paediatrics? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Anna Baverstock, who is a consultant paediatrician and the lead for senior doctor wellbeing at Musgrove Park Hospital in Somerset. Anna, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today.
Morning, Ashley. It's absolutely lovely to be here.
Now, tell me how the project that you have started in your hospital, which is a kindness to all in paediatrics project, tell me how that started.
Well, it started with a tweet. So 2 years ago, I was reflecting on the wider movements that I was seeing online, from obviously initiated by Chris Turner with the Civility Saves Lives project, but also the mantle was really taken up by Simon Fleming within the orthopaedic community with the Hammer It Out campaign. And I was reflected that I had witnessed some really challenging behaviour within paediatrics as a trainee and also as a consultant, and that I was aware that I had also potentially inadvertently at times, we all have mean moments and challenging times. And so I started to think, well, actually, I wondered if what we needed in paediatrics was a hashtag, being quite new to social media. So just sent out a bit of a tweet saying, the orthopods have hammer it out, the surgeons have cut it out. I've since learned that the obstetrics and gynecology had push it out. What would we have in paediatrics? Expecting a light-hearted debate on hashtags. And it did start off with, speak it out, play nicely, let's talk about it, some really sort of nice hashtags. And then people, I think, used it as a bit of an opportunity to reflect and talk about the behaviour they had witnessed or the behaviour that they had experienced. Just a hashtag. So actually, I decided to take the conversation off social media because as I've become aware, social media is not really the place to talk about some of the more subtleties in some of this communication, and had a conversation with Camilla Kingdon and Hannah Jacobs about the fact that I felt we'd started something, but we wanted to then do it in the proper way. So then we gathered together for the college meeting in 2019 and had a bit of a pop-up workshop where we talked about it a bit more. Because I guess we wanted to sort of capture particularly trainees' views. And then from there, Hannah Jacobs took it to the training committee. And obviously we wrote the paper in archives, really reflecting what rude, undermining and bullying behaviour looks like and feels like from a paediatric perspective. And at the same time, within my trust, we were also looking at civility and kindness and how we might start to have some conversations. And I thought, actually, what am I trying to say with this? And I came up with I support kindness for all in paediatrics. So as part of our project locally, we as a paediatric consultant team and the junior doctors and also the nursing staff, and now moving out to the wider team, have, I guess, signed up a little bit to a behaviour charter. And I particularly wanted to do it as doctors because I wanted to recognise it from a training environment. So we're supporting colleagues to seek advice and help with decision-making, a training environment, diversity and nurturing culture that's welcome and inclusive, thinking about excellence and shared learning, but also thinking about honest and feedback conversations. And part of that is a civility workshop, which we've been piloting in paediatrics and maternity, but are also spreading out across the trust.
So can we just deal with some of the sort of definitions to try and work out exactly try and work out the specifics of what you're talking about here? So civility, I mean, I think people talk about being civil, but does it have a specific meaning around healthcare, or is it the rudeness and unprofessional behaviour that you might say is somebody being uncivil?
So I think the really important thing about civility and incivility is it's very much how it's heard, not necessarily how it was intended or spoken. And I think this is often the root of such a lot of difficulty, is that we say something inadvertently or it's picked up in a different way, and there's a lack of communication just at that bit. Civility and kindness is around having a conversation where you're interested in each other, where you're looking to listen and learn. It isn't necessarily always about being nice, but it's actually about having that mutual respect for each other. And incivility and rudeness is about when how it's heard or how it's received is felt in a challenging way.
Now, you mentioned the paper that you wrote with Hannah Jacob, who is the immediate past chair of the Trainees Committee at the Royal College, and also Camilla, who's the incoming president of the Royal College. Three of you there contributing to this paper in archives published just last year. And the example in there is one I think will resonate with many of us about a trainee finishing a busy night shift, and having admitted a baby with suspected sepsis, and maybe not quite getting all the tests done before starting the antibiotics, for example, catching urine to rule out urinary sepsis, and that doctor being pulled up on it in the handover, maybe in front of colleagues. So that this is the sort of behaviour that you're pointing out and that you're trying to sort of overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think handover is a really interesting time, isn't it? Because by the nature of handover, half the people in handover are tired at the end of the shift, and half of the people in handover are hopefully refreshed, having just arrived. And yeah, it's clearly a key time for communication. It can be a key time for learning. But I think we also have to just very much think of everyone as individuals within that setting. I also am really passionate and interested in feedback, and I do really think that we can give developmental coaching feedback in a kind way, but we have to very much think about how we deliver it. So there's a fascinating concept called radical candor, which Kim Scott talks about. And that's talking about having a challenging conversation, having a brave, honest conversation, but doing it in a kind and supportive way. And I think that's the tone that we need to take into handover. So we need to have enough emotional intelligence to read the room, to read the trainee, to work out what feedback needs to be done there and then, and what conversation perhaps would be kinder to have at a different time. But it's not about avoiding having those conversations. We shouldn't be sugarcoating feedback. We should be delivering it in a honest way, because that's how we all learn. I like Brené Brown's take on it as well, and I think she makes me a little bit braver, and I have it as a bit of a mantra, and that's clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And I think sometimes we fear not giving honest feedback about something that's happened, or not having a discussion about our opinion on what's happened, because we don't want to be unkind. But I think the reality is if something's gone wrong or we've been in a challenging situation, we kind of know and recognise that. And sometimes not saying anything is worse than saying something. So I think it's very much about thinking very carefully about your intention with the conversation and thinking about the timing.
So there's a learning point within that example around making sure that you manage the children that you look after clinically as safely and as best as possible. So is it making a general point that if you were to be in that situation again, can we make sure that we collect the urine, or is it about trying to use a Socratic method to ensure that people understand what the issue is. By that I mean some sort of questioning about, you know, what samples would need to include in a septic screen, or, you know, what are the nuts and bolts here. So we can talk to the doctor at a time in which they're less tired and they can be a bit more reflective and understand and take the sort of feedback better. But what's the best way of approaching it in the room then?
So I guess I divide feedback in my head into I'm quite simple soul, into three areas. I think there's the positive feedback when you've done something well, and I think that every time is a good time to say that. I think sometimes we can be quite embarrassed by positive feedback. We don't particularly like being singled out, and we often negatively deflect it, and we then take away our negative deflection. But I think in general, positive feedback can be done, the kind of green light to go. And then there's the sort of coaching feedback, which in my head I have as amber. So it's kind of, you know, am I ready to deliver this? Is the room right for this? And what is the wider learning that actually it's really important that everyone does benefit from? Because I agree, Ashley, there are some learning points, whereas if you don't say something, then you risk everyone going away thinking, okay, well, that's how we manage things. And I think that can be done in a general way. I think if you've asked the question at handover, was the urine collected, and there's this sort of intake of breath around the room, then I would imagine for the doctor involved, the fact that nothing is said is sometimes worse than something being said. You know, oh my goodness me, it's so bad it wasn't even mentioned. So I think just to acknowledge that we're all human. You know, I the number of times I, as a paediatric junior doctor, was waiting for urine samples or desperately trying to get samples before completing the septic screen. So I think just recognising that, you know, it's challenging to get the urine, appreciate that, you know, in an ideal world, it would have been really nice to have the urine before giving the antibiotics, but clearly in this situation, it was really challenging. And then I think particularly, you know, colleagues having had a night shift and going home, I really worry about what the junior doctor then takes away to worry about. And I had some fascinating conversations with some anaesthetists during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, where we were really, really wanting to make sure that we were all able to just go home and have a rest and then come back fresh for the next day. And they came up with these great questions to ask in handover. And one of them was, what's going to stop you sleeping? What decision did you make during the night that you're going to be worrying about on the way home? And can we just have a conversation about that? And I just thought that was brilliant, because it's really generic. And so that they used that as a conversation starter as part of their trainee-led handover, which I thought was brilliant.
That is brilliant, isn't it? I mean, I'm always keen to make sure that the night docs that they're safe to get home, and you know, obviously organise for them to stay if it's been particularly challenging for them. But that's a really lovely frame, isn't it? What's going to worry you? What are you most worried about from the night shift? And do you want to talk about that? And maybe asking whether they want to talk about it out of camera, i.e. not in front of the room, could be helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think sometimes when we're having these conversations, we sort of think we have to wrap it up all in one go. And what I really liked about their approach was that it's what's going to stop you sleeping, and then there are some clearly wider learning points that we probably need to talk about at another time, but actually what's your immediate needs here and now. And that really plays into really listening and connect with someone at the point that they're at, rather than where we make lots of assumptions about people sometimes that I think is really wrong.
Can we look at some of those other areas that your focus group with trainees at the college that form the basis of some of the elements of the paper, which we will tweet out the link to. One of the other areas was obviously educational supervision and feedback. I mean, you talked a bit about feedback, but educational supervision is a really important activity, I think, for us as consultants who look after trainees and supervise and support their training. It's a really important interaction.
Absolutely. And I think it's more key than ever now. So I really, when I had a role supporting junior doctors, and particularly spent quite a lot of time supporting foundation doctors. And so many foundation doctors just didn't feel they had any sense of belonging within the departments that they worked. And I would reach out to their clinical and their educational supervisors and would be often told, well, they're only here for 4 months or they're only here for 6 months and we don't really get to know them and we don't really work together. And my response would be, goodness, what's it like being a junior doctor in your department? And I think, I grew up in the era of the firm. I had the same SHO, I had the same registrar, I had the same consultant. We were always on call together. We worked together. So I had a huge amount of psychological safety every time I came to work. And I really think that educational supervision and clinical supervision is how we restore some of that psychological safety, such that there's some key senior members within the teams that are interested in the trainee as a whole. Yes, interested in the learning and the professional development, but also just enable that psychological safety which underpins so much of learning, because we hear so much about how anxious junior doctors are within a shift. And I think if we can improve psychological safety, then we can enable trainees to thrive and to learn and to develop, because they feel that they're being held somehow, or feel that they have supervisors that they can go and have those challenging conversations with.
So from the trainees, there were a number of areas, weren't there? We've dealt with handover and educational supervision. There was also language and communication, which is so important, and then equality and diversity.
So from the equality and diversity perspective, I think it's really important to recognise that there is plenty of evidence that certain groups of colleagues are much more vulnerable to workplace incivility, bullying and harassment than others. And I think the evidence shows us, particularly colleagues with a disability, colleagues from the LGBT plus community, and also colleagues from Black, Asian and other minority ethnic groups are more likely to experience these really challenging behaviour. I recognise my own white privilege. I'm a heterosexual cis female. I have to say, in paediatrics, being a woman often means that you're in the majority, and again, we have to recognise that. I think the first step is to recognise it, and the second step is to think about how we can proactively change things. And I'm really proud of the proactive agenda that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health has taken on this, particularly looking at the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda and making that really front and foremost of the work moving forwards, to try and understand more about it and then to try and look to what we can do. I've recently been on some really interesting discussions with international medical graduates, and just listening to their stories has been extraordinary in terms of raising my awareness in how I can better support our more junior colleagues, particularly thinking about from the educational perspective, but also just looking at the kind of wider cultural issues. There is so much research that the more diverse and the more inclusive all of our organisations are, the better care that we're going to provide. And I think that's what I really want to be a part of.
Yes, indeed, a really important group to think about and support in this way. But what about following on from that? So the other healthcare professionals that we work with, how's your project rolled out to them, and are they involved in what you're doing in your hospital?
And absolutely. So I've been doing this project in maternity as well. And what was fantastic about doing this in maternity was it was initiated initially by midwives. So we've done this in a very multi-professional way. I think it's quite interesting. I've been reading a little bit more about culture and cultural change. And I think we also do have to recognise, as paediatric senior doctors, so consultant, staff and associate specialists, that we do have a leadership role. And I do think that therefore we have a role in modelling that behaviour. And I think our senior nursing colleagues and our senior allied health professionals also have that role. I think we can only look at things like kindness and civility as a wider team. This isn't about a single group of people going in and being able to make a dramatic change. It's about enabling everyone to have that conversation. We talk, part of the civility training that we do is we talk about what happens when you witness rude or uncivil behaviour, what you might do. And we have some conversation practice and we look at what we might be able to do. And I guess my first my first challenge is, can we just simply ask? So if someone is immediately rude to you, are you able to just say, wow, did you mean to say that? Or I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Or, perhaps I didn't understand that. And if you do that, 95% of the time you'll get a reaction, an apology, oh, I'm really sorry. Occasionally you'll get a flat denial, but you will normally get a behaviour change associated with that. Now, clearly that's easier for some of us to do than others. And the Vanderbilt University in the States have come up with this really brilliant concept of the cup of coffee conversation. So the cup of coffee conversation, as described by them, is that you can ask an active bystander to have that conversation for you. So the active bystander can purely come to me saying, Anna, do you remember that conversation you had with your colleague? Well, they were left with it they were left following that conversation really upset, and I just wanted you to know. So you're not trying to solve it, but you're just merely doing that very initial pointing out. And the results from their studies are fascinating. So I guess the training and the conversations that we have is, if you're a junior nurse on the ward and a more senior consultant has been really rude to you, you may not feel like you can have that conversation yourself, but can you speak to a colleague who can then have that conversation for you? I'd love to get to a situation where we can feed up and across as well as feed down, but I appreciate that's much more challenging.
And what about witnessing these sorts of episodes? If you don't, I think, as you put it in the paper, out the unprofessional behaviour, you're in some way complicit. That can contribute to stagnation and contribute to more distress and upset that nobody was there to call it out, to acknowledge it, to maybe try and reframe the conversation or reformat the conversation or make it happen in a different way at that time.
It actually goes stronger than that. So if you and I are in a resus situation and I am really rude to you, then it'll have an impact on you in that you will be worrying about it. You will affect your quality of your decision making. It'll affect the decision making within the resus and ultimately the patient care and patient safety. There's been some really brilliant sim scenario research by Riskin et al. But there's this ripple effect. So if I'm rude to you within the resus and there's 10 people in the room, it has an effect on every single member who's witnessed it. So they will also have a reduction in performance. They will also not want to put their heads above the parapet and have a reduction in their willingness to help others. And the Civility Saves Lives poster illustrates that really beautifully with all of the percentages. And then I think that for the very junior members of the team, they think, okay, well, that's maybe how we get things done around here if no one says anything. So I really think that as senior members of the team, if we witness behaviour, and you can tell when it happens, people kind of looking around going, gosh, did that just hear it? You have to be that really brave person. I can remember several years ago now, we were in a big paediatric teaching session when a colleague from a different specialty came in and gave some quite challenging feedback, was very rude to a junior member of the team who hadn't done a blood test. And there was absolute silence. And I can remember feeling I have to do something, but I can remember thinking I'm not brave enough to try and have that conversation in this room. And also, actually, that could potentially be quite undermining. So the colleague left the room and I then left with them. And I then had a conversation about the fact that I felt that was a really challenging way to deliver that information. And I appreciate that they were really upset and that their operation had been delayed, but that actually, they had a responsibility not to, to think about how they communicated. And so he then said to me, are you expecting me to go back into that room and apologise? And I said, well, that would be absolutely lovely. And he looked at me and went, oh, God, you owe me. But bless him, he did. And the power of that was huge. And actually, everyone respected him so much more for that. And I suspect whenever he had patients on the ward again, everyone just worked that little bit harder. So I think that actually there's something really lovely about watching someone apologise that just makes the situation so much better. But actually, you don't reduce respect for someone, you increase your respect for someone when they put their hands up and go, I'm really sorry, I'm having a bad day, that was really rude. But there have been many other opportunities where I haven't been so brave. And now, of course, I really try and make sure that I do have those conversations, because, of course, that's very much part of what behaviour change that we're trying to achieve.
I'm sure respect for you went up as well in that situation. Leaving the room, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? To follow that person out, you leaving the room. How does that leave the room for you?
Well, to be honest, we were all speechless. So you could have heard a pin drop. So I think had I sat in the room, it would have felt, we'd have talked about it anyway. So the natural reaction was to leave and follow. And I guess that was just instinct. I didn't really think about that. But I can remember as I left thinking, I've got to be really brave to have this conversation, rather than, because I think he was expecting me to say, I apologise. So he was clearly slightly off guard when we had that conversation.
So you tell that through a nice story. And so Chris Turney, you've mentioned, did a really lovely TEDx talk around civility, where the majority of that talk is relaying a situation and a story and unpicking what might happen when there's unprofessional behaviour around. So I think that's a good one to reinforce what you're saying. But tell us a bit more about Civility Saves Lives.
So I think it's becoming much more well known. I think Chris Turner's TED talk is brilliant, and I would absolutely recommend it to everyone. He has been incredibly generous with me. He and I have had several conversations. He's often talking at conferences, and I think that there's some really fascinating data, particularly on the website, around and increasing research in theatres and in communication and when communication breaks down.
Now, you mentioned some studies, so there's quite a lot of published data out there, and some of it actually, very, very scientific. You mentioned some research by Riskin and Erez, and this is interestingly within the paediatric domain. So these are neonatal, one of their papers anyway, neonatal simulation scenarios in which either the parent or a facilitator is rude about the team, and the comments are either about the hospital or about the care, and the performance of the sim team in these clinical scenarios is then rated independently and scored, and the statistical analysis of that, as I understand it, which suggests that in those scenarios where the rudeness is at its worst, performance of the team is also very poor.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I read the paper, I thought, gosh, it's interesting, because on the one hand, you could kind of think that the team would sort of unite against against the comments and sort of, and it would sort of almost increase the performance. But of course, it doesn't. I think the brilliant thing is it's being studied in sim. There's also been some really interesting studies in theatres where they had a patient on the table. I think it was again a sim scenario. A patient on the table having some sort of hemorrhage, and the anaesthetist and surgeon trying to work together. The surgeon was either rude or helpful, again, a little bit stereotypical. The anaesthetist in both scenarios recognised when they were working with the rude surgeon and when they were working with the polite surgeon, but the anaesthetist felt that it hadn't impacted on their decision making. So the anaesthetist didn't have the insight into the fact that actually when they were working with the rude surgeon, their performance actually decreased compared to with the polite surgeon. The converse is also true. So I think Riskin has also started to do some work on gratitude in teams. And this certainly plays into a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I guess that the focus on the training. So I could run a workshop on rude, undermining, bullying behaviour, but actually I chose to flip it round and run a civility workshop. I'd love to run a kindness workshop, but the trouble is with the word kindness is that I think it's been kind of misappropriated over the years a little bit. I think people tend to think of it as being quite nice and a bit of a softer skill. Whereas, so I think civility and the Civility Saves Lives is a good input, but actually what I'm talking about a lot when we do the workshops, it is kindness. Because the origin of the word kindness is fascinating. So it's linked to kin and kinship. So it's linked to a kind of a solidarity and humanity, or solidarity and human need. And I really like that. So it's a kind of recognising of being of the same nature, of being of a kind, of a kin. And I think that particularly in healthcare, it really resonates for me.
I think you mentioned stereotypical sort of behaviours. As paediatricians, we're thought of as kindly and of softer nature and somewhat more approachable, maybe family-minded, family-centric, holistic, all of those things. Do you think as a specialty we are different to other specialties in this area of civility and kindness?
So the honest answer is no. So I think that's, we're human. I think potentially that our versions of rude, undermining, uncivil behaviour looks a little bit different. I think in general, as paediatricians, we're probably quite good communicators. So I think, and that's can be a double-edged sword. So I think sometimes we're perhaps, certainly the behaviour that I have witnessed and received has been much more of an undermining, subtle nature rather than a very sort of upfront bullying or rude attack. And actually, arguably, sometimes that's harder because you're sort of second guessing yourself in terms of thinking, have I said that? And certainly when we started looking into it on Twitter a couple of years ago, some of the threads that people were tweeting were heartbreaking and really, really challenging to read. So I think that I think that any aspect of healthcare where human beings are working closely under potentially quite stressful situations will have that range of behaviour. I think it's also, we're all capable of having a mean moment. I think absolutely, under pressure, sometimes we don't always behave as we should or as we would like to, but we're all capable of apologising. So I think maybe that's what we need to kind of focus on.
And we're also in the business, as paediatricians, of looking after, children who have at least, usually more, very concerned other human beings with them. So our interactions with children and our interactions with parents are also a unique challenge of our specialty. And I guess, parents with anxiety and worry, potentially, the worst moment of their life, when their child is really unwell or when they have a condition that is difficult to pinpoint, diagnose, and it can bring anxiety and worry, and we see that manifest as challenging behaviour in parents as well, that we need to try and work through and work with. Oh,
absolutely. And I try and reframe it. So there aren't difficult parents. There are just parents who are having a difficult time. I'm a parent, but when my children are poorly, you worry about them and you think about them in a really different way. Absolutely. And I think that, that again, we need to sometimes kind of take that step back, and and that's why one of the sort of even more important that we kind of make sure that we try and work as a team and look after each other as a team of colleagues, such that we are able to provide that kind, compassionate care to the families who are having a difficult time, even when their communication with them can be really challenging and opinions and decision makings over treatment can be really challenging. Actually, we need to fundamentally do that as a team. You can't often manage those challenging situations on your own. So even more reason that we need to kind of rely on each other as colleagues in that time.
And I would include parents as part of that team, because we're all on the same side in that way,
absolutely. So. And parents, and there's some of the data again is when parents witness colleagues being rude to each other, that kind of erodes their trust a little bit as well. They are, and I don't know if you've ever been on a ward, so I've certainly been on a ward with the children and when they were poorly, and you just realise how public everything is. Those curtains are not soundproofed. You can hear every single conversation. And before you've even, the ward rounds even come to you, you've formed opinions on how the team is functioning. I think sometimes we're so used to a clinical environment, we forget how on display and on show we are.
Absolutely, it's normal environment for us, and we sometimes need to remember how scary the ward is, not only for the children sometimes, but for the parents, despite our best intentions to make it not so. Can we come back to your local civility project includes a charter for your team to sign up to, and you created the badge. Then the badge is available. I mean, how did you link up with this Science on a Postcard?
So Heidi from Science on a Postcard, I think, just does some really beautiful creative badges, and she'd done this really lovely badge supporting diversity in orthopaedics, which was coloured with the rainbow flag and brown, black, pink, blue. And I was sort of I'm quite creative, so I was sort of playing around with paediatrics and playing around with kindness. And I sort of sent over an idea. And so she just came back, I support kindness for all in paediatrics. And I just thought, oh, that's wonderful. So I bought a stack of badges to kind of initiate the project, and then suggested to her that she might want to put some extra ones on her website. And what was so lovely is they sold out within about 10 minutes online, and she then had to reorder them. So we're looking at broadening that in our trust. So I've had a brilliant bit of pushback saying, well, what about the rest of us? Are you going to be nice to a surgeon? And clearly, yes, absolutely. But I guess there was something about getting your own house in order first. And also I wanted to reflect some of the national conversations that we'd had at the college meeting and following the paper. It is just a badge. It can be very tokenistic, but I think there is something about when you're trying to change a behaviour, about having a visual reminder. Families have love it. They often ask about it. And it's certainly a talking point. And I just think the fact that it's sold out on Heidi's website so very quickly means that there's something in it that other people have taken it on. So I know Jothy and colleagues in Milton Keynes have done a project as well around it. So it's lovely to see it taking off. It's for everyone to take on and develop, really.
So I hope we've got shares in the badge making, but it's great. It's great spread. It's great to see the spread of it. So it becomes, in a way, its own movement. Well, look, it's been really interesting chatting, and I'm sure there's far more that we can deal with. But I think we'll draw it in there. I mean, before we finish, I like to try and close with a few summary learning points, take homes. What would you like to share for people as a final thought, as some closing remarks?
So I think don't underestimate how important this is. We're working at a time when it's very challenging in the NHS, where well-being has never been given so much prominence. And actually, how we communicate with someone is something that we can do for free from today. Being kind to each other, thinking about how we communicate. Remembering this isn't about being nice and creating artificial harmony. This is about being clear and kind rather than unclear and unkind. I read a lot, and I think some quotes can be really helpful for this. So I just wanted to add in a very famous Maya Angelou quote, which I'm sure lots of people will remember, in that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's really at the heart of the message that we're trying to talk about.
Well, thanks so much, Anna, for being kind and generous with your time. It's been fascinating talking to you, and this project really resonates. We look forward to seeing it spread.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for taking the time to download our podcast this week. If you enjoy our podcasts, please tell your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and of course, our SoundCloud. Thanks for listening.